Hi, and welcome to this webinar from the Alaska Tribal Technical Assistance Program. It all starts with planning why your long-range transportation plan matters is being presented to us today by Miles Brooks. Miles is a tribal coordinator for FHWA Office of Tribal Transportation for Alaska Tribes. He's worked nearly 16 years in Alaska's transportation industry in both the private and public sectors. And we are happy to have him presenting today. And now I will turn it over to Miles.
Thank you, Vicki. Again, thank you for having me, everybody. Again, Miles Brooks, Federal Highways Office of Tribal Transportation, and I am sitting today in Wasilla, Alaska. So without too much further ado, do want to steer today's conversation again with starting with planning, right? And touch base on why your long-range transportation plan, specifically your tribal long-range transportation plan, matters for both your program and your projects. So real quick before I begin, I kind of want to take some advice from someone that's more experienced from me and think about the planning process backwards. And I'd like to just stop here for a minute, let everybody take a minute or so as I walk through this slide and think about a project or where that project came from, right? A lot of times we see projects constructed and that's the end result, right? That's what we all kind of strive to do from a tribal transportation program and other transportation projects, right? Delivering projects, getting a project built and open to the public. But I think along that way, we lose sight of where that project began. And oftentimes it begins as a comment, an idea, a need, or a suggestion, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, oftentimes many years before that construction gets delivered. So before we kind of get moving here, I just want to take 30 seconds and just give everybody kind of a chance here to think about a project, current or past, transportation or otherwise, and just take the next 30 seconds of silence here that I'm going to give you guys and think about as that project was being constructed. Think about all the challenges, the issues, the hiccups, the lawsuits, all that stuff that happened kind of the point from right around that project being designed or constructed, and think about those challenges. And I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds here and then we'll resume. We'll come back together and I'll kind of talk about why I'm given that 30 seconds here. So again, 30 seconds, think about it, and I'll be in touch. All right, so within that 30 seconds, and I'm not going to put anybody on the spot here, but I want you to remember those issues, those challenges, those lawsuits, the starts and stops during the construction and the design of your project. And I want you to keep those in your mind. And I want you to think about them as we continue this presentation and this conversation today. And I want you to kind of hopefully correlate some of those challenges with, especially the conversations and the back and forth and the negotiation. And especially for the tribes that are on the phone today, is really look at that as really what those were as part of your planning process, right? Now, some of those planning processes, i.e. challenges, conversations, et cetera, happen maybe really late in the project. Some of them happened really early. But what I think you'll find, though, is if we take a good planning approach to our projects in our LRTP and the other plans that feeds into, those challenges hopefully become less severe or non-existent as we get closer to project construction. So as we move along today, I'm going to cover a couple learning objectives that were outlined in the abstract of this presentation. And again, I'll remind us here what we're all here kind of to learn or at least discuss throughout today's time together. As we move through today, we're going to talk about the purpose of a long-range transportation plan, specifically from the tribal perspective, the tribal long-range transportation and what that means. We're going to also talk about how the LRTP relates to the National Tribal Transportation Facility Inventory, or the NTTFI, how your LRTP relates to the Tribal Transportation Improvement Program, or your TTIP, as well as other plans, how your LRT might feed into those other plans, and how other transportation plans outside of your tribe may feed into your LRTP, and where they might overlap and work congruently to deliver transportation projects in your area of the state. Also, we'll understand why a current or an updated LRTP is important for your transportation program. And then finally, we'll wrap up touching base on the process for updating a current or drafting a new LRTP. So starting off, the purpose of an LRTP. And one of the things I find with the tribal transportation regulations at 25 CFR 170 is that they're really written in a question answer format for those of you that have had a chance to look at those. So really how it's presented is in 25 CFR 409, the question is proposed, what's the purpose of a tribal LRTP? And it really is, you know, this right here is pulled from that answer in 409A of 25 CFR 170. And that purpose is to clearly demonstrate a tribe's transportation needs and a developed strategy to meet those needs. So in reality, what does this mean, right? And for the purpose of today's conversation, as we discuss what the purpose of an LRTP is, we're going to break this statement down into two segments or two sections here, right? The first one we're going to focus on in this first portion of today's conversation is demonstrating a tribe's transportation needs, right? So the purpose is, again, demonstrating those needs, and then later on we'll talk about the developing strategies to meet those needs. So as we talk about that, and we further, get into the purpose of the LRTP, demonstrating that transportation needs, right? There's kind of some four general areas, and we could dig much deeper into these when we look at the regulations, both from a tribal transportation side of things, as well as some of the other deeper research and available resources on these topics. But I just really want to touch base on what these mean, how a tribe demonstrates their needs within the context and the purpose of their LRTP, and those areas for really showing the needs, right? The first area, setting goals and objectives for your transportation network, reviewing your current network, taking an analysis of your network gaps, right? Comparing your existing conditions against the goals and objectives for your network, and then setting priorities to fill those gaps are all kind of general activities that help support demonstrating a tribe's travel transportation needs. So as we get there, we talk about setting goals and objectives for your network, right? One of the main cruxes of demonstrating need is to really take a look at where a tribe wants to be in 20 years. And that's outlined in the LRTP regulations, right? So the question we really got to ask ourselves is, again, at the bottom here, where does a tribe want to be with their transportation network in 20 years? So to do that, the tribe really considers all the overall network first, all the overall goals for its transportation network. So to do that, we really have to consider, right, all the modes that are available to tribe, that the tribe would like to capitalize in 20 years, right? And we look at surface modes, right? And that's everything from your pedestrian modes, snow machines, ATVs, normal highway vehicles, automobiles, pickup trucks, commercial motor vehicles, as well as the different networks that they use, whether it's a trail, whether it's, a gravel road surface, whether it's a paved road surface, right? We also look at our air system, right, that we use as part of the tribal transportation network. And that includes your passenger system, as well as your cargo and mail air system, and the network. Are you a hub committee? Are you a spoke community? Are you an on-demand air community, depending on the situation and the time of year? Also looking at your marine network, right? How do you use the marine network if that's an option to you? Is it a marine in terms of cargo transport only? Is there a passenger marine network as part of that? And how, when you look at these, again, how do you want that network to look in 20 years, right? If your community is solely relying on airfare, an air network with minimal surface and marine options to fulfill your transportation needs, then maybe that goal in the future is to reduce the dependence on air and produce more reliable or even a surface network to meet those needs. So when you're looking at those goals, what we really want to look at is, in that context is, how should the network be designed? How should the network be built over 20 years? How should the network be operated in 20 years? And how should that network be maintained once the network those goals are met, right? And part of that goals, and if you remember, your goals and objectives could also be the status quo, right? The status quo could be, we don't want roads connecting us, but we want more reliable airfare and what that looks like, right? And maybe it is to produce more reliable airfare, you need a lighted runway in your community. Those are all goals that kind of contribute to, where your network will want to be. And the thing to remember with your goals and objectives is they are developed in a consultative manner, right? Which really comes down to two words, is public involvement. And we're going to touch pretty significantly on that phrase throughout this whole conversation, as well as the update process to your LRTP. So when we set goals and objectives for your network, and in context of the regulations for your tribal LRTP, it all comes back to that simple question: is where does the tribe want to be in 20 years for their transportation network? Understanding where you want to be, the tribe also needs to understand where their network is the status of their network is currently. So again, you still look at those same things as your network, but you look at it as how they exist, right? Again, you look at all your modes, your surface, your air, marine. How does the tribe, how do you use that network, right? Is your network all self-contained within your village? Or does your network go well beyond your village, right? If there's frequent trips from your village to Fairbanks for a variety of reasons, whether it's healthcare, commerce, recreational, social activities, employment, right? You look at that and you look at that network and how do you complete it, right? Your network really might consist of, when you think of it, is what you consist of, how do we get to Fairbanks regularly to meet our needs, right? Well, I got to get in my truck, I drive to the river, I get in a boat, I cross the river to the other side, I get in my other truck, I get in a vehicle, and I get to Fairbanks. Or that network might be, we go to the airport, we get on a small plane, we get to Fairbanks to do what we need. Those are all evaluating how you use your current network, and you do that as an aggregate, as a tribe, right? Many people contribute to that. And that gives you an idea of what your transportation network is as it currently exists. Those things to consider, right? What does that current network consist of? Is there a surface mode connection to meet your needs? Or is it just air only or marine only? Is it seasonal, non-seasonal? Any things that prohibit the use of that network, right? So those are all questions, right? How's the network used? What's the condition of the network? How is the network designed, right? You may have a network, but the network is in very poor condition, so it doesn't provide any reliability. And if your goal is to improve the condition of that network, you have your gap. But again, finally, when this final bullet here is, we'll talk about the various resources. You really kind of come up with various resources available for reviewing your current network. You can collect data. If data is not there, public involvement in your LRTP development, when we get to there, can really supplement a lot of the limited data. And again, the general question on this kind of purpose point of your LRTP is, again, where is the tribe currently with their network? So as you kind of get those points, you know where you want to be, you know where you are, you can really start to see where the gap is, right? So at this stage in the purpose, as it's developing your needs, a tribe will compare its current network to its network kind of goals and objectives. And this begins to take shape of resulting in needs, right? Other areas during your public involvement, your public what does the public perceive your needs to be? Also, you'll all look at what are the various alternatives to eliminating the gaps, right? Maybe your gap is just getting to a hub community, right? With no specific means to get there. You can look at various alternatives to eliminating the gap and the pros and cons of those alternatives. Is airfare a reasonable and reliable alternative to address that gap? Maybe so. Maybe a road connection is needed. Maybe it's a road connection to a bigger hub community, which provides more reliable air services to your regional hub, right? So maybe it's from one village to the next village, and then that village's air service is much more reliable to get to Fairbanks. So you really want to look at that whole analysis of how to address those gaps at this stage. Also at this point is, what happens if the gaps or the needs are not filled? It's also what happens if we leave the things the way they are, right? What does that do to the tribe's advancement in many areas, cultural, social, economic, etc. So as you start to see the gaps, they begin to kind of start shaping your transportation network at this stage of your or not your network, but your transportation program at this stage of your LRTP. And again, the general broad question at this area is, again, what does the tribe need to meet its network goals? And the final kind of scope of activities here as we develop demonstrating needs is finally, as we know the gaps for our system, is to begin setting priorities or begin coming to an agreement on how to prioritize activities that fill those gaps. And through that process, through your LRTP, through policies and procedures that result from your LRTP, a tribe will begin to establish which kind of priorities take precedent. Questions to kind of ask as you're figuring that out is, what approach should the tribe take to prioritize projects? What priorities should be addressed before others? Is connectivity a more important priority than safety? Is condition more important than safety and regular connections? Those will all kind of be discussed and will start to take shape as your LRTP kind of takes form. But those priorities, and sometimes you can connect both of them at multiple at the same time. You can connect reliability and safety, or conditions and reliability. So again, those questions start to flush out. Also, as you develop your criteria during the LRTP, the questions to ask yourself, the public, the tribal leadership is, how do the tribe's prioritization criteria meet the goals and needs of the plan? Ultimately, the reason you have a plan is to get a tribe from its current state to the state it wants its network to be in. And again, here we'll touch on this repeatedly, as public involvement contributes to the criteria development. And the question again here at this portion is, really, how do you prioritize one project over another, right? This is where the tough decisions start being made in your transportation program, right? We all know there's a long list of needs from tribal communities, but we also well aware is there's very limited funds to accomplish all those needs. So again, at this stage and this purpose of the LRTP is to really start the conversation and making those tough decisions on, we have X amount of dollars, whatever those sources are, what can we do with those dollars to get us towards our goals on this cycle of the LRTP? So again, a quick recap on the demonstrating transportation needs portion of the purpose of the LRTP. In this stage, demonstrating needs really does help set up, we want to set goals and objectives as we start to look at our needs. We want to review that current network, which will help us contribute to that need development. Taking your current network, comparing it to where you want your network to be, begins to start showing the gaps. And then finally, as we know those gaps, we want to start setting priorities to help fill those gaps and have us a focused direction as to deliver our transportation program. So when we come back to this statement again, the purpose of the LRTP, right? Again, is to clearly demonstrate a tribe's transportation needs and develop strategies to meet those needs. So the second portion and the second kind of purpose of the LRTP is, once we know our needs and some sort of prioritization to kind of start beginning, how do we address those needs? The second real strong purpose of the LRTP is develop strategies to meet those needs. And within the developing strategies, things like developing a funding strategy, finding ways to link your needs gap to the funding strategy, right? Is your funding strategy, and we'll touch on this a little bit, is your funding strategy just wait for the TTP dollars to come in? Is part of the funding strategy to go out and aggressively seek grant funding from federal or state or other nonprofit entities? Do you have the capacity to raise revenue from a tribe standpoint yourself? So those are all things that when we establish a funding strategy and then linking our needs to that strategy are part of this portion of the purpose. And finally, what you'll see here is the purpose of the LRTP is it really starts to develop your program from a tribal transportation perspective, or your TTAP to carry out your priorities. And then finally, the wrap up of these developing strategies is looking and implementing and monitoring your plan, which will help evaluate whether your strategies are meeting, are addressing the needs of your transportation network. So as we continue with that purpose of the LRTP, establishing a funding strategy, one of the things that I've seen with some LRTPs is sometimes you get a wish list, and the purpose of an LRTP is not necessarily a wish list, but you can see how it kind of creates one, right? You have these needs, right? But if you've looked at where your transportation system needs to be in 20 years compared to where it is now, it becomes up with a needs list, not a wish list, right? It's just those things that get you to where you need to be in 20 years. As we further refine the LRTP and you kind of develop a funding strategy, the plan here is also to create a funding plan within those needs, not necessarily a wish list. So the questions you got to ask yourself as a tribe when we get to LRTP development, when we're kind of talking through with your citizens is, what are the tribe's financing capabilities? Right? Does the tribe have policies and laws and ordinances in place that allow them to raise capital? Are they allowed to under their structure? Can they bond? Can they borrow? Have they been competitive with US DOT grants in the past? All those are questions to think about. What are the tribe's financing capabilities? Other things to kind of consider is how much money can the tribe expect to receive for needs, right? So if the plan or the only option for a tribe is to receive TTP dollars for all their transportation needs, that question, when you answer that question, will help create a funding plan to meet any needs that you might possibly be able to, but knowing that with the limited TTP funds we receive, the wish list, not the wish list, but the funding plan is very limited in addressing the needs. And then also what funding opportunities exist outside to address the needs. So all these things kind of start thinking about, what pots of money can we expect, what are reasonably available, and what may be out there that may be coming in the future. And again, we'll come back to this again and again. Public involvement and tribal laws and policy will all play a role in this funding strategy in how a tribe can fund projects to meet its needs in the LRTP. And again, it really comes down to the final fundamental question here is, how does the tribe pay to build and operate the network? So as we get a funding strategy and we know our needs gap, as we develop that strategy here is to really link the gaps with the funding strategy. So this is where we start to really kind of look at specific projects or programs that help bridge those needs, right? So we begin to link project types with funding source eligibility. If in our funding strategy, we know there's discretionary grants out there, those funding sources are available, and we know we have 2 or 3 projects that meet those thresholds. That's where we start to link and connect the dots in our program, right? Other questions to think about at this stage or in this stage of the LRTP is who's responsible for securing that funding? Is it the transportation director for your tribe? Is it the tribal administrator? Is it a grant writer that you consult? So all those questions start to flush out here. Who's going to lead those efforts? Other things as you link those things is the funding source predictable or is it short-lived, right? We know things like the TTP, your TTP annual shares are fairly predictable in the sense you know you're going to get them, and the dollar amounts are somewhat consistent, but the amount you get is low. However, we think about some of the grant opportunities that have been deployed under the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law. We know what the funding amounts is, but we know that theoretically it's short-lived in that we don't know if these programs and dollar amounts will exist after 2026. So those are all things as we link projects with those funding sources that we got to think about in the strategy here. And always keep in mind, some projects or programs may be eligible for multiple funding sources. And during your LRTP discussion, this is where you can kind of connect those dots and outline all the various opportunities that may be able to meet these needs through the projects and programs. So again, the key focus here is kind of connecting the funding sources with your projects that address your needs. So as your LRTP begins to take more shape, the real purpose of it starts to take shape as well, and that's feeding into your program, your transportation program, right? So as you begin to see the needs, the funding strategies, the schedules, all associated, and who's going to do what and when, you can start to see how that would shape your tribal transportation improvement program to carry out your LRTP, right? And when we think about your transportation program, it really is an ongoing initiative comprised of a group of projects or an organized set of activities, which includes other programs. So when we talk about your TTIP or your Tribal Transportation Improvement Program, it is the 4-year outlook for your program that is delivering upon the needs and the strategy as defined in your LRTP, which is, again, your long-range plan. So as we talk about that formation as we start to see the connection between the LRTP and the TTIP, that purpose, we start to ask ourselves, from a tribe perspective, what programs are ongoing to meet needs, right? Because you know where your network is currently, you know where it needs to be, but the thing that you also got to consider is, what do we need to do to keep the status quo? So if we focus on area B, we don't step backwards in area A, right? Other things to consider at this point too is what projects can be delivered to meet the needs, right? If we have a funding strategy, we connect the projects with the sources. This part of the LRTP going into the TIP really asks us, what can be delivered at that period? What's the schedule for these projects, right? And what the key fundamental question here is what is the tribe ready to deliver when we get to this portion of the LRTP and the TTIP? And what you'll see sometimes with some of your LRTPs, you'll see in your priority list, you'll see short, mid, and long-term priorities, right? And an approach many take is your short-term priorities is kind of what goes into your TIP. And as you address those short terms, then you move on to your midterms. And by the time you rewrite or update your LRTP, your mids become shorts, your longs become mids, and then you come up with new that might come your long term. So that purpose is really the purpose at this stage of an LRTP is to get a tribe to really think about what can it undertake and what can it deliver under its program. And finally here, as your LRTP, and we'll touch on this later too, is implementing and monitoring your plan is a key part of developing strategies here, right? And we'll talk, again, like I said, we'll talk more, but your tribe keeps the plan alive by reviewing annually and update every 5 years. As we look at those strategies, we need to also consider, is there new information about the network, right? Have new gaps been identified? Have tribes prioritizations or priorities changed since the last update? And is the program meeting the goals and objectives, right? As you deliver your TTIP and your projects, are you getting closer to your long-range goals? If you're not, then you've got to ask yourself a couple different questions. Is if your program's is effective, or maybe your goals weren't quite the right goals when they were set. So again, with the public involvement as you implement and monitor your plan, you'll see how your program advances. So again, ongoing monitoring keeps your LRTP, your plan, your transportation plan on track. And again, the broad question to ask here is, are the tribe's efforts, and I looked at it as an aggregate, your LRTP, your TTIPs, your maintenance program, et cetera, reducing or eliminating your gaps or getting you closer to where you want to be as a tribe in the 20-year range of your plan. So as we kind of wrap up the purpose of your LRTP here, and the second portion of the statement that we talked about earlier, when we develop strategies, things is developing your funding strategy, linking your gaps and your funding sources together, developing your program or your TTIP to carry out your plan, and implementing and monitoring your plan are all kind of the key 4 steps, 4 areas here that a tribe really should consider when we talk about developing strategies to meet your long-term transportation network goals. So again, I'll beat this to death one more time here, is remember your LRTP's purpose is 1, to clearly demonstrate your transportation needs, and 2, to develop strategies to meet those needs. So as we move on here, we kind of get at least I hope a broad level of the purpose of your LRTP. The reason a tribe should have an LRTP beyond just because 25 CFR 170 says you must have an LRTP. I'd like to shift focus here and really kind of briefly touch upon why an LRTP is important and the relationship to the tribal transportation facility inventory system, your tribal transportation improvement program, and other plans. So within the LRTP regulations, there's instructions on, there's a question to this, to the extent of, how does a tribe use its LRTP, right? Its long range plan. And again, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that the CFR in this part is really set up like as a question and answer document. And again, it pulled right from the answer or the regulation at 174.14 is that a tribe, in short, uses its TTP long-range transportation plan to develop transportation projects as documented in a tribal priority list or its TTIP, and to identify and justify the tribe's updates to the National Transportation Facility Inventory. So what this really means is the LRTP is a bulk, hopefully a bulk of your planning work, so that when you move into pre-project planning and ultimate your TTIP and your projects and programs, or updates to your facility, your tribal transportation facility inventory, your eligible routes, that hopefully if you've walked through the LRTP process well enough, that most of those issues, challenges, discussions have been really discussed and hammered out during the long range portion. So I'll continue to talk about the link specifically to the inventory and the TTIP here using this same diagram. So for those that aren't familiar with the inventory that are on with us today, the National Tribal Transportation Facility Inventory, or the NTTFI, is at minimum transportation facilities that are eligible for assistance under their tribal transportation program. Can also be used by the tribes to assist in transportation and project planning, i.e. identified transportation needs. And then finally, to update the inventory, adding a facility. If you want to add a facility, which thus creates eligibility under the tribal transportation program for that facility, The addition of that facility in the inventory is supported by LRTP documentation. Now, I want to clarify here, there's been, maybe some questions on, is an LRTP update also the same as a facility NTTFI update, and vice versa? Is an NTTFI update the same as an LRTP update? And my interpretation is no. Is if a tribe looks at if the tribe looks at its LRTP and has determined that the network goal, the network needs in the LRTP are stated, and all the projects are on systems that are already included in the NTTFI, then no update to that facility to the inventory is needed. However, an update to the NTTFI would be needed if, for example, a need for a tribe would be a new road that doesn't exist and it hasn't been proposed yet to link it from one village to another. That would constitute or maybe needed an inventory update. So I would say it's not a two-way street on whether an inventory, an LRTP is an inventory update and an inventory update is an LRTP update. But they do have a relationship when it comes to adding new facilities in the inventory. As we mentioned during the purpose of the LRTP is to help shape or help kind of develop your transportation program or your TTIP. And again, as a reminder, your TTIP identifies all of your TTP funded projects and activities that you would like to carry out or expected to be carried out over a 4-year period. The TTIP is also, per regulation, consistent with your tribe's LRTP, and your TTIP is reviewed and updated by the tribe as needed. So the key takeaway here is if you want to use TTP dollars on a project or program, first it's got to be in your 4-year program, your TIP, which is essentially your schedule and budgeting tool. And that document, the TTIP, must have kind of organically derived from your LRTP. So again, the fundamental, the key overarching idea for here though is if a project or program is not included in your TIP, you cannot spend TTP funds on the activity. And to get that project or program into your TTIP, it's got to align with your goals and priorities and missions and objectives of your LRTP. And thus the connection between the LRTP as well as your TTIP. And one way I like to look at it is the LRTP is what we would like to accomplish. And the TTIP is, this is the small pieces of what we'll do in the next 4 years to accomplish what we will deliver to accomplish our goals. Other areas or other links from your LRTP to other plans. LRTPs from a tribal perspective can be coordinated with tribal cultural and economic plans. So if you have a community or a village or a tribal economic plan that says, we want our village to be the key tribal tourism destination of the state, and your LRTP doesn't reflect the transportation needs to meet those economic plans, it's important that you bring those plans together. And maybe the economic plan of the tribe is much more current than your LRTP, and you want to use your transportation program to help meet your economic plan, but the LRTP and your economic plan aren't in unison, there could be some problems there. So again, the more current your LRTP is, the better it can match other current plans to achieving a whole host of tribal goals. One of the biggest relationships we see under this bullet is LRTPs and housing plans in communities, where a influx of housing funds may come into a village, but for the construction of the housing or the community portion, but the transportation infrastructure needs to kind of be put in before those developments. And if that, if housing, transportation, housing development, roads are not a goal or a priority or even a blip of the imagination of the LRTP, can be some disconnect with getting that project in the tip. So again, at least looking at your LRTP on a somewhat regular basis and comparing it to some of your other plans within your tribe and your community can help all the other activities that are going on towards your development. Also, your LRTPs, you'll coordinate with states and their political subdivisions as mentioned in 25 CFR 170 and other appropriate planning authorities on regionally significant TTP projects. So if you get a tribal project that's going to be pretty significant, your LRTP will start that planning discussion, and the other informed stakeholders will look at your LRTP to kind of get a sense of what that project is looking to achieve, some of the challenges, what the schedule might be on that project, and a whole host of other issues. Also looking at the current Alaska DOT LRTP, and I know they're under an update, and I'm not sure if it's finalized yet, but a statement there that really caught my attention is that the DOT has said there would be a commitment that they'll commit with federal and tribal partners in programming of projects developed through tribal LRTPs. So having a current LRTP there and trying to deliver your projects will also go a long way with the DOT coordination of LRTP and their STIPs and et cetera. And then finally, your tribal LRTP kind of provides an indirect link to the Alaska Federal Lands Collaborative LRTP, which is a same kind of process that the federal lands, so the Forest Service, BLM, et cetera, use towards development of their transportation program and plans. And again, tribal efforts with that, your LRTP tribal efforts may also overlap with the Alaska Federal Lands Collaborative LRTP. So again, having a current LRTP and linking those together can go a long way to identifying common projects and common goals. So we've talked about so far the purpose and kind of the link of an LRTP. So now we're kind of going to hit the home stretch here. We're going to talk first about the importance of keeping your LRTP current. We've touched a little bit on that to this point. And as this presentation goes on, we're going to see how these ideas start circulating and they kind of feed off of each other and feed into each other. So why is keeping your LRTP current? As we've previously discussed, your tips must be consistent with your LRTP. 2, what we're finding here is many bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, grant, and priority opportunities require applicants and recipients to meet FHWA planning requirements. And then finally, we've touched a little bit on this, but we'll also talk about it again here, is changes in your network goals and conditions can affect your gaps and priorities and thus the strategies. So if you're using strategies that are more current to this day to address needs from 20 years ago, they may not necessarily meet to fulfill those needs. So again, everything's starting to kind of be repetitive here, but again, it's important, and I want to touch base on it, that your tribal transportation improvement programs, your TTIPs, must be consistent with your LRTP. That's clearly outlined in 25 CFR 170. And that's the case with with many other entities, state DOTs, metropolitan planning organizations, also have to have LRTPs and TIPs that are consistent, that meet the goals of those. But to come back here, the tip, right? Must identify year by year all the TTP funded projects and activities for a 4-year period. So if your tribal transportation program wants to do something within the next 4 years, it plans to do it, it will do it, and has the money for it, it must be on the tip. Second, Your TTIP must identify all projects and activities that are carried out by the tribe in accordance with 23 USC 202A9. So those are your 202A9 transfers. So the challenge here could be you have a project that you apply to the state DOT for, the Alaska DOT. You exercise your 202A9 transfer rights. It comes to tribal transportation. We need to get it on your tip, but that project is not consistent with your goals and your LRTP. It's going to slow down the awarding of that project until we can match the LRTP to your TTIP. So again, when you look at these discretionary opportunities or other opportunities, hopefully they connect with the needs in your LRTP. And again, if your needs have changed, change your LRTP to help reflect those. And with your tips always include public involvement. So if your LRTP has been developed, it's current, a lot of the heartache that might arise in a project being added to your transportation improvement program, your TTIP, will already hopefully have been addressed and figured out during the LRTP process. So again, the key thing to kind of take away here is an updated LRTP provides the context for which the tribe develops its tribal transportation program or its TTIP. So also I mentioned many of the bipartisan infrastructure law opportunities require applicants to meet the planning requirements, right? So in a few of the programs here that might be familiar with, that I know some Alaska tribes have been successful in the past. Again, the high priorities project program, which has recently been funded again. From the Q&A, one of the requirements is that once you're awarded those funds, you have to update your TTIP to include those awarded funds. So again, when you submit your TTIP for update, part of that process is to ensure consistency with your LRTP. So if those don't align, we have some issues. Your RAISE and your nationally significant federal lands transportation tribal projects, federal requirements such as planning and applicable laws and regulations of FHWA will apply. So again, having your LRTP be current to match the needs, the current needs of the tribe, which match the needs of the project or award, is also important in keeping your LRTP updated. If you have a project that builds a bridge across a river and your LRTP doesn't address that, or your LRTP said we want no connection across the river at all, but things have changed in 20 years, there's a disconnect there between the project and the LRTP, and it could cause some nightmares. So again, as your community's needs change or the tribe's needs change over 10, 20, there's some LRTPs that are even older than that out there. It makes it hard to justify a project that might address the legitimate current needs if your documented needs are significantly out of date. And again, there's might be opportunities well outside of tribal transportation that may require tribes to follow planning requirements. We've touched on this a little bit thus far as we kind of get closer to the end of our time here together. But changes in network goals and conditions can affect the gaps and priorities, right? And your changes can include a variety of things, such as your gap and elimination as projects are delivered. Changes in goals, right? As generations move through a tribe and elders pass on and the middle-aged folks become elders and the kids become middle-aged folks, priorities and goals will change. You'll see an influx of funding. You may also see social and political changes within the tribe. You may have an LRTP that is adopted in, say, 2020, and you might have a whole new political dynamic in your tribe through a council, and they want to go a complete 180 with projects. They can do that, but they've got to go back and update the LRTP to reflect that will. So the LRTP is a way to protect the future goals and conditions of where your network wants to be from political winds. And And it really takes some effort to change those goals and plans if the political winds change. So again, as your network changes, the tribe's goals and objectives will change. The LRTP should evolve to reflect such. So that's a lot. We've covered the purpose, we've covered the link, we've covered why an LRTP being current is important for your tribe. As we kind of bring it home here, we'll talk about the final topic of today. We'll discuss is updating, or how to update or write a new LRTP. And the beautiful thing about this one and this section of the CFR for LRTPs is that the process is very broad, provides a lot of latitude, and I think is very minimalistic in requirements. So first and foremost, your LRTP, or the tribal LRTP, is developed in one of two ways, but they both involve the tribe. And the first way is the tribe working through a self-determination contract, and that's your Public Law 638 contracts, a self-governance agreement, a program agreement, and or another appropriate agreement. A tribe can basically develop and edit or update or write their own LRTP. Or the BIA or Federal Highway Administration can do so, can write the LRTP for you, but only upon request of and in consultation with the tribe. And then the tribe and then the federal agency, BIA or Federal Highways, have to come to an agreement on the methodology and elements. The key thing I want to pay attention to, for the tribes to pay attention here, is if you go through the BIA or Federal Highways to write your LRTP, is that the tribe will be charged, that work will be funded from the tribe's share of the TTP funds to accomplish that. So I don't have any familiarity with how that works. I haven't been part of one of those requests, but that is an option. Going back to the first bullet, when we say the tribe working through a self-determination contract, agreement, etc., that could mean the tribe's transportation director. It can mean an employee of the tribe. It can mean a consultant or a contractor hired by the tribe. But what I really want to take is the tribe is the one leading that effort. Moving on to the second key bullet here is the LRTP process is very minimalistic when it comes to mandates from the CFR. There's only two mandates or two requirements in the CFR of the tribe when you update or write your LRTP. The first one is the tribe and BIA or Federal Highways, whoever you work with for your program, will conduct a joint midpoint review. There's no description or definition of what that review consists of or how it takes place. All it says is that we'll do a midpoint review. And then the other mandated requirement is that there's public involvement and that the public reviews a draft LRTP. And then the tribe refines the plan with received public input. Those are the only two mandated requirements of an LRTP. So again, key things as we update your LRTP, again, we've heard it a lot and it's going to keep going. Public involvement is required. Public involvement really begins the moment the LRTP development begins. So as you start looking at what your goals are, what the current system looks like, all those topics we talked about under the purpose, public involvement for that really starts the moment you say, hey, we're going to look at this LRTP, and it should. Your public involvement should include a range of users, your private citizens, and your major public and private entities. So if you're a tribe that also has a city government, it's probably good to get your city government, your tribal government looking at those. If you have a private, maybe your village corporation, your utility operators, all those folks should be kind of part of that public involvement. Public involvement at 25 CFR 170 also must include either meetings or notices or both as you're updating your LRTP, and that's up to the tribe to decide. And the policies, so your policy, the tribe must have a policy, but it's kind of outlined here in one of two ways. The tribe may use its own established policy for public involvement, That is, you have a tribal ordinance or policy and procedure or administrative code that allows for and what that looks like. Or you follow the process outlined at 25 CFR 170-413. So finally, for updating your LRTP, the regulations say a tribe reviews their LRTP annually, and that review can be as minimal or as significant as the tribe wishes. It can be just a reread of the LRTP and move on. And only things happen if things need to change. 2, the regulation requires that an LRTP be updated every 5 years. Updated in terms is not really defined in the regulation, but it just says updated every 5 years. Things to consider when we look at LRTP reviews and updates, to meet kind of the public involvement process and the annual and the 5 years. Some ideas that have been out there that have been thrown around is creating a tribal policy or procedure for your LRTP to review and update. If possible, there's been tribes that assign an initial review to a tribal employee or a small committee. Some tribes coordinate a TIP update with their LRTP. Every time they look at their TIP, they look at their LRTP, and if no changes need to be made, they move on to it. Other tribes use annual transportation meetings. They just run an annual meeting, ask if there's any updates to the LRTP that need to be looked at, and kind of move on from there. But the key thing to take away here with your LRTP and updating your LRTP is don't let it collect dust. Tribes put a lot of time and money and effort into creating the original LRTP. Keep it alive. Don't let it sit on a shelf. It's a lot of money to spend on a plan that's not referred to when you're delivering your program. So that's a lot of information to take away from here. Again, the things that we've talked about today, we looked at the LRTP's purpose, and that purpose is to demonstrate needs and to identify strategy to meet those needs. LRTPs guide not only your inventory, but your tribal transportation program and other plans. Current LRTPs can ensure needs and strategies align with current opportunities. And finally, that updating your LRTP is a tribally driven process with minimal regulatory requirements. So we started off with this question is where this project came from. And I really wanted everybody to take about that 30 seconds to think about that. Again, as we kind of leave here today, and when you leave here and go on about your day, kind of think about what we discussed here. If you look at the regs, for some reason you come back and watch this video, think about that again. Think about the project. Think about the challenges, the lawsuits, the starts and stops of construction, the 1 or 2 guys that just said, we don't like this project. Think about how those could have been better addressed or even prevented through your LRTP process and through a LRTP that continuously evolved as your program evolved. And hopefully, as your planning portion of your tribal transportation program evolves, when a project goes to construction, it kind of goes off seamlessly. So I'll leave it at that. Again, this is going to be recorded and I think maybe put into a PDF format. There's additional resources here from tribal transportation. There's the program delivery guide, which covers planning, LRTPs, and tips. There's FHWA tribal transportation planning modules, which go much more in depth, not only on the purpose, but the steps and the development of your tribal LRTPs. And finally, if you're thinking about your finance plan, there's also a link here too, for those that may not know, you can always look at your tribal shares on the OTT's finance website, going back to about 10 years, I think. So you can see the level or consistency of how much your tribe has received in the past, as well as going forward, what you could expect. And then finally, when all else fails, or maybe even as your first step, reach out to your Federal Highways Tribal Coordinator, or if you're a BIA tribe, reach out to your point of contact engineer there and ask the questions and really sit down and talk about, is my LRTP current? Does it meet our needs? Are the tips you're receiving from us, the T-tips you're receiving from us, consistent with our LRTP? So I appreciate everybody's time. I know that was a lot of information in a short hour or so. I think we're approaching here. So I'm going to leave it for questions. My contact information is there. And with nothing else, thank you.
Thank you, Miles. If anybody wants to either raise their hand or post a question in chat all right, here we go. Okay, P. Sams, I'm allowing you to talk. So you can unmute.
Hello, can you?
There you go. Yes, we can hear you. So go ahead and ask your questions.
Okay, great. This is Pat Sampson with Old Settlement Native Council in Bethel. I need a whole class on public involvement because I've tried public involvement and nobody shows up. So, and also you said public involvement or comments start when the LRTP is developed. Does that mean, like today I'm redoing my LRTP, and so comments and questions or whatnot on social networking, can I use those as public involvement? And will that meet the requirement that I'm supposed to be posting a hearing on LRTP on this and such a date? And how do I go around? Because I've set up public involved meetings and nobody shows up.
So that's a good question. So again, coming back to the regs, there's, if you have a tribal policy on public involvement, and if the social media posts fulfill those, then obviously that would pass the threshold, because the first method that the first method of public involvement that tribal transportation really encourages is a method that's approved by the tribe, right? So if that's a method you approve from a tribe, I would say go for it. And then the second part says, well, if the tribe doesn't have an approved method, maybe you just never got around to saying this is our approved method, or this is what we will do or won't do. The second caveat is the tribe can use locally accepted practices. And that really actually, that language really tried to help Alaska tribes, because at first it was like, put notices in the newspaper. Well, how many tribes in their localities have newspapers, right? So local acceptable practices might be things like social media, or posting notices in the washateria or the post office, or, at a basketball game. So all those things, it really gives a broad leeway to you using other methods if they're kind of locally accepted practices, if that makes sense. If I were to ask the members of your tribe in the area, is getting information on Facebook or Twitter or whatever a reasonable way to get information in your community, and most of them said yes, that to me says that's a culturally accepted practice. Does that it's a long way of saying yes or no to the question.
That gives me a better insight on how to fulfill that requirement.
To answer kind of the second concern you had with people not showing up, that might be a separate question that you might need to reflect on yourself and other folks within your program. Is, while the social media may be an acceptable practice, is it the right practice to get people concerned, right? And the case very well might be that nobody, I hate to say it, but maybe nobody's interested in that. But at least you gave them the whole purpose of that public involvement and posting in an acceptable way is to provide people with the opportunity, right? And that's what we're really striving here to say is, when you get a project in construction and people say, I didn't know anything about this project, or you never gave me a chance to provide my input, as a planner and a transportation director and whoever else is involved, you can say, hey, we provided opportunity to comment on this project at the LRTP, at the TTAP, at community meetings, right? And we did so in a way that everybody gets their information. So it kind of makes that objective during the, the objection, a little bit, it gives some defense to you as a transportation planner or director or whatever your role is to say, hey, we provided opportunity and nobody said anything.
All right, thank you.
And my contacts here, you're welcome to email me or give me a call, or and we can look at, there's definitely materials on public involvement and effective public involvement in tribal nations. And I think a study was done from a few up here in Alaska as part of the thing. So if you're interested in that and you reach out to me, or drop your contact in the chat pod, I can reach out to you as well.
All right, we have another question from Leanne. So Leanne, I just hit the allow to talk button, so you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I just had a quick reply to the gentleman's question before me. Yeah, it's really hard to get people involved in attending public gatherings. I live here in Huslia, and what helped us before is providing a lot of door prizes, and food will always bring people together too. And I just had a quick question about when you were talking about linking the LRTP to other plans, and you said that the AKDOT said they'll cooperate with federal and tribal partners in the programming of projects developed through tribal LRTPs. Would you be able to talk further about that, or?
I would defer that to the DOT planning group, and that is their plan. But I think part of what that really means is when a tribe applies to DOT programs for projects, that the DOT will honor the tribe's planning process. So if the tribe says, we need project X, we're applying to the state DOT for project X, that when the state DOT looks at that project for consideration, that the state will honor kind of the tribe's planning process that got them to that point of application. One other area the state does do that is the state's STIP, the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, their version of the TIP. They incorporate all tribal TIPs within the state of Alaska. They incorporate it into the state plan by reference. So what it says is something to the effect that the state DOT, Alaska DOT STIP, also includes projects that are within the tribe's T-TIPs. So there's also that link there too.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? If not, I will thank Miles again, and I'm going to stop recording.